first book you see up on your far left is called God is Here to Stay. We did a presentation here back in 2014, and then that was followed up with God and Randomness. And this book is the third in the series. The first two books are sort of generic in nature, and trying to look at what the best scientific evidence is to make the case for the existence of an intelligent creator called God. And in this particular book, third book, which was published late last year, we wanted to focus specifically on Christian tradition and how we could interpret these ideas in terms of our Christian faith. And we also didn't say much about the world religions in the last two books, and so we wanted to complete the trilogy by folding in Christianity with the science and faith questions, and also adding to that the world religions. So last week, I focused in on the science part of it, and this week I'm going to focus in on the world religion and how we Christians can sort of begin to think about integrating some of this in new ways. What I need to do is ask how many of you were not here in this room last week? Okay, still quite a few people. How many of you had the opportunity to see the video which was recorded last week? If not, I'm going to do a very quick thumbnail sketch, and then I'm going to jump into it. So essentially, what I want to start showing you is, first of all, we talked about this being the pre-scientific view of the universe, which you might recognize as we talked about it last week. This is pre-modern science. It is frequently called the inverted dome view of the universe, and it was often thought that the dome, you look up in the sky, it's like a dome. The stars were holes in the dome, which the light behind them was able to penetrate. So the stars that we are seeing at night under this set of perceptions about the nature of the universe is really the light behind it. We now know that that's not the case. You will see the Earth, which is considered flat at the time rather than our spherical Earth. And underneath that is the underworld, which was called heaven or hell. None of being above. Even people say, now, I hope one day when I die I will go to and not to. I still do that a lot. But actually, in terms of the modern cosmology, there is no up and there is no down. There is no high and there is no low, and that will become clear. We, in fact, could be on the bottom of the Earth right now, and the only thing that's holding us up is what? Gravity. And if gravity wasn't there, we might fall. Oh, by the way, Henry, I expressed my appreciation to you earlier, and I want to make sure you hear it.
Oh, well, thank you. Now that I walk in late, that's good.
There's another point there. No, I'm not earlier. I do want to express my appreciation to you for all the support that you give.
Well, thank you for being here, driving up here every couple days.
That's good. Okay, but anyway, this is the way that the Earth looked, or it was assumed to be before the development of modern science. Now here is the old pre-scientific view of the universe, or let's put it this way, what was thought to be the universe, and you see smack dab right there in the middle of the sun. The Earth. This is called the Earth-centered view of the universe. And around it goes the moon, and then there's Venus, and the sun is thought to go around the Earth, and we now know that's not the case. So if you fast forward, as we did, here is now what we assume to be the way the universe looks. Upper left-hand corner is called Earthrise, which was taken by the astronauts in Apollo 8. It's one of the great photos of the 20th century. And it's the photo we use on the cover of the third book. Off to the right is now our solar system. And as I said earlier, we are the third rock from the sun, not the fourth rock from the sun. I think that's correct. Here we are. And we are in that so-called Goldilocks zone where all of the elements of the universe have to be coordinated in such a way that carbon life as we know it can begin on Earth, which started about 3.85 billion years ago in our solar system. The sun at the center started about 4.5 billion years ago. Lower left-hand corner is our galaxy we call the Milky Way. We are in the suburbs of our sun and solar system. Is sometimes called in the suburbs. And you'll see it there where the arrow is pointing. And then finally, the one on the right is our galaxy, in the midst of really hundreds of billions of galaxies, which we now know comprise our enormously large universe. Okay, here is an artist's rendering of our cosmos. It's a bell shape. On the left-hand side, you'll see what is called the Big Bang, which is really more of an inflation. And then there's expansion that's continued ever since. Christianity has struggled with the question of how do you reconcile the six-day creation story with modern view of the universe. And there are four positions, which I'm not going to go into because I did last week. They're called Old Earth creationism, Young Earth creationism, Old Earth creationism, Intelligent Design creationism, and Evolutionary creationism. And we developed a scale here that shows on the right-hand side that 96% of the information associated with evolutionary creationism is closer to how modern science goes about investigating the universe in order to discover the laws of nature. But there are three other Christian positions on this, and I wish we could repeat what we did last week. We're not here for that. So basically, this is where we ended up last week. Our universe is unimaginably old and large. From a theological perspective, the God who created the universe is even greater and more amazing. The more we understand about the universe, the more we look at Psalm 8, which says, "My Lord, how majestic is thy name in all the earth." And I have a number of colleagues who say that modern science, in fact, enhances our understanding of the nature of this extraordinary God who created the universe. And one of the really strong affirmations, is that this extraordinarily amazing God can love each one of us individually while at the same time being this creator of the universe. The width of the universe now is 92 billion light years wide. That's traveling at 186,000 miles per second for 92 billion years. That's pretty big. It's unimaginably large. And this is the God, think of the nature of the God who brought this into existence. Has to be something pretty amazing. So, from a B perspective here, from a theological perspective, God is amazing. And C, science is stimulating the steady growth, and this is where we make the transition between science and the world religion. Science is stimulating the steady growth of the global village via electronic technology and mass transportation. This is very clear that all the great religions of the world, which are at the heart of the great civilizations of the world, developed in relative isolation. One can, for example, in order to understand the Middle East, it's necessary to understand the Quran. But Muhammad knew nothing about Taoism or Confucianism. But in order to understand China, it's necessary to understand Confucianism and Taoism. To understand, let's say, India, it's necessary to understand Hinduism. So it needs development isolation. Buddhism as well, which is located in central China and East China, which is called Korea and Japan, or even on Taiwan. Taiwan is also part of this isolationist development idea. But now, no religion or culture exists in isolation. We have access to a little machine that all of us carry around called the iPhone, and a whole bunch of these things called computers. And if you want access to any religion in the world, any scripture, it is one finger away, including your language translator. If you want to use that, get everything that you need to know about any area at the touch of a finger. Now, E is really the second one. How are we to understand this phenomenal God in relationship to our growing perception of a variety of world religions that populate the earth? How does Christianity fit into this growing global awareness? Now, one thing we need to say is that the world has always been religiously pluralistic. The difference now is that we are in each other's presence in a way that we weren't before. So it's possible for the neighbor next door to come out of one of these religions. And as we said last week, the number of Hindu temples is growing in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, the number of Buddhist temples, and so on. We are in an increasingly pluralistic religious environment. And Christianity, of course, is part of that. Here's the way in which the religion, here's the way in which the world religions are located. The purple you see up there is Christianity, and the green spot across North Africa and going northeast is Islam. And both of these, two of the largest world religions, really expanded because of political conquest. I don't know if that's, let's say, political expansion. Anybody who's studying the history of Islam knows that between the years 750 and 1258, Islam expanded. The colonialism starting in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, what we call European colonialism began to develop. And you'll see North and Central and South America is purple, Christian, largely because of the Spanish going into Central and South America along with Portuguese and the Protestants going into what we would call North America, but then also the Catholics as well. Either converting the natives or, in so many cases, simply exterminating them. And you'll see the same is true of South Africa. South Africa is the result of the expansion of Christianity after the Western powers, French, Dutch, English, and so on, began to control and rule those countries. The whole saying, after the general comes the priest, and to some extent that's true. It's true not only of Christianity, but it's true of all the great religions that have expanded around the world. Not exclusively. You'll see there's India. Indians who can't understand Indian culture without knowing Hinduism because it's right at the core of it. To the east of that is Buddhist ideas, plus indigenous Chinese religions and so on. So this is a map that's easily accessible on the internet and so on, but this gives us an idea of how the world is sort of subdivided according to the religions of the world. Now the next is, here's a sort of statistical table. You can see the religions on the left-hand side and the size going across the top and then the percentage. Right now, 1 out of 3, well, everybody in here belongs in this church, and by definition is Christian. But if we were, let's say, a macro population of the world, 1 out of 3 of us would be Christian. Then you go down to Islam, it's 1 out of about 4 or 5 of us. Islam is the fastest growing religion right now. And by the year 2070, according to the Pew Foundation, Christianity and Islam have approximately 3 billion members. That's a big tent. And by the 22nd century, Islam will probably be the largest religion in the world, mainly due to demographic factors, because Muslim people know Islam for children or family. But these are projected trends based upon current trends. And it's entirely possible that these trends will be altered, as they always are as we go into the future. So you can see the percentages. It's not necessary to go through every one of them, but you can see how large they are. These are huge, huge populations, especially when you get down to Taoism, which is the 5th one down. Taoism is only 400 million, 394 million, which sounds large on the surface of it, but when you compare it to 2.3 billion or 2.4 billion, it's still relatively small. The really interesting one down there is Judaism, which is the 4th up from the bottom, only has 14.5 million people. And yet it's one of the most influential religions still in the world. It has to be included. It's frequently included in what's called Big Five, which are Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. And the first 4 are monsters in terms of population size, where Judaism, despite its incredible impact, is really very, very small. So let me show you. Can you find Israel? Can you find Judaism on this map? There's one little speck, and you see where it is. If you know where the Mediterranean is, you'll spot it immediately. So you can see it is literally dwarfed by the other religions of the world. There are only about 6.6 million people in Israel, and the largest group of Jewish people outside of Israel is in the United States. Half of them, I think, live in New York. But also, Dallas-Fort Worth is a very substantial Jewish population and very influential. So we move along here. When you think about the religions of the world, this is the one way to divide them up. On the left-hand side, you will see the monotheistic religions. Zoroastrianism, and then the Abrahamic threesome, which is Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then Baha'i, which is a relatively young religion, only about 200 years old. That's an extension of the Shiite branch of Islam. Now, 200 years might sound like a fairly long period of time, but the history of religions is not. It's fairly short. The new religions are generally defined as 200 years old or less. That would include the Latter-day Saints and some other religions as well, including a new religion in Britain called the Jedi Religion, which is based, believe it or not, on those very famous films. Star Wars. The middle is pantheism and animism, that's Hinduism, Taoism, Sikhism, Shinto, traditional Chinese, and then you have spiritual atheism, or non-spiritual atheism. The spiritual atheisms are Buddhism and Jainism. The non-spiritual are what we call classic atheism. And this is where we must be careful, because there are many people who come out of Buddhism and Jainism who do not believe in God. But they do believe that the highest goal of humanity is a spiritual experience of some kind, generally referred to as nirvana, which is an idea picked up from Hinduism, which Hindus call moksha. But if you get to atheism, which is a non-spiritual form, that's generally associated with the West, Western culture rather than Eastern culture. So in the West, when we say atheism, generally what that means is disagreement with the idea or rejection of the idea that there is a supernatural being of some kind called God. That's what atheism means. Agnosticism is a more complicated kind of thing. It could be that this God exists and that I don't really know, and besides, it's not important to me because I want to get on with my life. That sort of thing. You know? So you say, that's true. Agnostics tend to be the kind of, oh, well, could be or couldn't be, but what does that have to do with me? You know, I'm still got to go to work tomorrow morning, you know, those kind of things. But anyway, when you take all of these religions, you can really kind of pull out of them 4 specific elements. The first element is materiality, which deals with what we experience with our senses of touch and smell and hearing and taste and so on. And that's the realm of science. Science is about one thing, and that's to discover the laws of nature. How does the material world work? When scientists begin to reflect beyond the boundaries of their vocation of science, they have left the realm of science into the realm of philosophy or theology. And there are a lot of people who argue that science and atheism go together, but not necessarily. There are many scientists who are believers, and you don't have to be a believer or a non-believer to do science. You can carry on your experiments without being a member of any of the religions that populate our planet, or you can be completely neutral on any of that. So the world of science does not require a God hypothesis to carry on its business. In order to introduce a God hypothesis, it's necessary to take off your science hat and put on your philosophy hat or your theology hat. And this is something that frequently gets confused. I have a number of students who think because of science there is no God, and I say I can draw that conclusion. And after a few minutes of discussion, we begin to see that there is a difference between thinking about where science or the physical universe came from and where it's going, which is a philosophical question, as opposed to how do we do science, the criteria of which are defined by the National Association of Sciences, which we use to compare the 4 points of view that we talked about last week. The other one is transcendence. And transcendence means that God is apart from the physical universe in some way. And basically, there are 2 ways to think of it. God can be apart from the universe permanently after starting it, or God can be apart from the universe but occasionally intervening into it by violating the laws of nature or making special revelations to special people. And if I were to say to you, is God inside this table, you'd probably say, I don't get it. That'd be a monotheistic position. If you say, yeah, God is in this table, you were probably a Hindu. Now that takes 3 hours to explain how that conclusion can be drawn. But nonetheless, that's the way we think about it. But you think about somebody in our, let's say, the the founding fathers of this country, which would be Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Roosevelt, and so on, what was their faith? And they were sometimes called deists, which means God was like a watchmaker. God created a watch, like a watchmaker would do gears or reports or whatever the system is, and then wound it up or started it, and then stood back and let it run on its own national. So God would act with me. But if you're a Jewish person, there are a couple of events that were very important. One was that voice that came up from a burning bush that talked to Moses. Now, anybody see a permanently burning bush where a voice could come out of it? See, this is a form of intervention, revelation intervention. When Christ was baptized by John the Baptist, heaven opened up and there was a voice that said, what? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. See, a specific event, a specific intervention, and so on. With Muhammad, when Muhammad was meditating at age 40 on the mountains around Mecca, especially on Mount Hira, he heard one word, which was recite. And that was the first impetus for 22 years of revelation that eventually got written down, and what we now know as the Quran. Now, what's interesting about Muhammad is he had 22 years of revelation. Jesus had 1 to 3 years. Very, very different. And comparing Islam and Christianity and Judaism as the Abrahamic faith is always a fun thing for a lot of us to do, and so on. And it is really fun to do. But anyway, that's another story. So anyway, so you have transcendence. So it can walk on water, for example. Jesus walking on water. Jesus turning the water into wine. Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead after 3 days and so on. These are specific interventions into not only the social process, but into the physical process by suspending the laws of nature. And there are a lot of scientists who refuse to accept the belief in the spiritual nature if it applies to suspending the laws of nature through so-called alleged miracles of violating those laws. And that's part of the background to modern atheism and agnosticism and continuing systems in systems that God can intervene that way creates in the mind of some people a great deal of skepticism. But that's just a part of the world we live in right now. And one of the great modern scientific views of the universe is that there is a God out there who can intervene in the natural laws and in fact suspend or violate them, or can in fact intervene through revelation that are given to a specific messenger at a specific point in time and in history. So that's transcendence. It's a difficult concept to understand in terms of all the little subtleties that are associated with it. So I'm just trying to provide a little bit of overview for it. Immanence means that God is within. God is not within us specifically, but God gives us souls. And the destiny of that soul is dependent upon the so-called expectations that God lays upon us with regard to our religious beliefs. And the assumption is, if we follow those religious beliefs and behavior, after we die, we will have an award that is called heaven. Or if you're a Muslim who follows the Quran, that award is a paradise. So you get this kind of immanence, but generally speaking, it's the Asian religion, starting with Hinduism, that put a great deal of emphasis on immanence. And it's the monotheistic religions of the Middle East that put a great deal of emphasis upon transcendence. Moving along, you can really organize all of these religions into 4 little boxes. On the left-hand side, you see the religions where God, or gods, is embedded within nature, and you'll see cell 1. There are many of it. This ultimate spiritual reality. This is Shinto in a lot of indigenous religions. Go to cell 2. God as ultimate spiritual reality, only one God, which is Hinduism, Monism and Dualism, Taoism and Sikhism. That emphasizes immanence of God. Under cell 3, you will see religions where God is outside of nature or transcendent, and here you get Hinduism again in polytheistic form. Hinduism is probably the most complex religion in the world, maybe the oldest religion, and there's a lot to be said about that, but if someone wants to talk about it, I'll be hanging around afterwards and we can chat. Ancient Greek, Roman polytheism, henotheism, which means one of the great gods like Zeus is superior over the other gods in the pantheon. And most of the indigenous religions of the world have had some form of belief where God or the gods, especially the gods, were outside of nature. And then cell 4 is where we would put monotheistic religions. There's one God who's transcendent and outside of nature, and then there's Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Muhammad. Those are the ones we talk about generally as the great religions of the world, including some of the other religions as well. Now, here we get to the meat and potatoes of the second part. This first part so far, we're just kind of scoping out empirically how our world is set up, and how those different religions of the world, in fact, combine various elements to end up with such really different perspectives. Now, there are three ways to relate to religious diversity, and especially views of salvation. All right? And I talked about that a little bit last week. The first one is called Exclusivism, and it's basically only one perspective is truthful and all the others are false. I am right and you are, that's right, my way or the, you got it. That's called exclusivism. The other one is called inclusivism, where all perspectives contain some aspect of truthfulness, but one is superior to the others. All right? My religion, I realize that all of you have some insight to your religious truth, but mine is superior to yours. And until a new one comes along, I will keep mine because it's superior. Now, I'm going to critique some of this a little bit later, and you probably have a sense of the direction I'm going to go in, but you'll get a sense of it once we get a little further into the discussion. And then finally, there's pluralism, which all perspectives are equal in providing alternative images of salvation, and no one view offers the only pathway or is hierarchically superior to other religions. So under D, you get a kind of a sense of all the religions there. Starting at the top row on the left is Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and what is called the yin-yang religion of both China and Japan. The bottom, that's the symbol on the far left of Hinduism. That's Sikhism next, and that's a Torii gate in Japan, which signifies Shinto. And then on the far right lower is the great wheel of Mandela, or life that is associated with what religion? Buddhism. Yeah, you got it. Okay. Now, all of these religions offer some image of life after death. All right? Now, what does that mean in terms of how we're going to deal with the religions of the world? Now, what we've got here, and I've gone through, you'll see if you've read the book, we take 5 religions and we show how you can find passages in the texts or the sacred scriptures of all the religions that can justify all 3 positions. And all the 3 religions of the world have followers of all 3 positions. So if you are an exclusivist, here's your favorite passages. Christ is the only pathway to salvation, and they are John 1, John 14, 6. No one comes to the Father except through me, meaning, of course, Christ. Acts 4, I've tried to get 2 or 3 different passages here to reinforce it. There is salvation in no one else, which refers to Jesus, and in Timothy, there's one mediator between God and humanity, Jesus Christ. And if you go to Hebrews, that's very, very clear in Hebrews, that that's the case that's made very vociferously. Support for the inclusivist position, this is kind of the 2-tier view. Christian inclusivism places Christianity at the top of the list of world religion and ranks all the others as secondary, if you take this position as a Christian. Now, there is a scholar who took this position. His name is Karl Rahner, and he is a Catholic priest, and he developed a very interesting phrase called anonymous Christian, and this is his view. According to the Trinity, where Christ is equal to God, Christ fulfills the divine mystery completely, and at the same time, God's grace is available to all. Therefore, for Rahner, this means that loving non-Christians, whatever their faith, are anonymous Christians. Now, we'll get to what that means a little bit later, but here's now support for Christian pluralism, if you go in this direction. When asked by a young lawyer what he must do to inherit eternal life, Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and of course your neighbor is yourself, which comes out of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. John 1:47 is beloved, let us love one another because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God, and whoever does not love does not know God. He doesn't say you have to espouse a certain doctrine in order to be one of the elect, or one of the specially chosen. It says you can be a person of love, and wherever that expression of love occurs, it means that God is in the midst of that environment somewhere. And then 1 John 4:16, God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Like the golden rule, if you want to be treated with love, you should treat others with love. You want others to love you, and so on. So you can find in our scripture, if you're very careful in selecting your passages, which of these three positions you want to espouse. All right? And Luther once said too, when he started quoting, others started quoting scripture against the Reformation, he said, the devil can quote scripture. That was Luther's response. And to some extent, if you look hard enough, you'll find something in there that will support whatever you want with. And in terms of how the religions of the world can relate to each other, one can find exclusivists, pluralists, or you can find inclusivist passages. Now, which one of these is preferred? This is the interesting question. And exclusivism is the least preferred. Okay? There's a lot of exclusivists in all the religions of the world and in Christianity too. And here's the reason why. If you look at the right-hand side, you will see the percentage of world religions, which is simply a repeat of what we did earlier. 32%, 24% for Islam. And if you're in any of these religions, you are considered one of the saved within that religion. Which means everybody outside of that religion probably is not, if you're an exclusivist, and if you go over to the left-hand column and turn your head 90 degrees, right, to the left, it says percentage of worldwide population excluded by the exclusivists. And in the best case scenario, you see Christianity under number 1. If only 32% of the world's population is Christian, and you're an exclusivist, and salvation comes only through Christ, you've just left out over 2/3 of the world's population. And that's the best case scenario. You go to Islam, it's 76% are excluded from Allah's paradise. And it just gets worse from there. And by the time you get to the right-hand side, you squeeze out just about everybody who's going to end up in some sort of negative condition of afterlife as opposed to a positive. And if exclusivists insist that their way is the only way to get to a positive afterlife, then you've excluded the majority of the world's population, irrespective of their religion, because Christianity right now just happens to be the largest religion, and no religion is in excess of 50% or will, or let's put it this way, or is projected to be based upon current trends. So in any of the great religions of the world, exclusivists ignore, if you want to think of it that way, the large majority of the world's people in terms of their conception of a positive afterlife. And here's the way we think of salvation. We find it in the book as well. Nobody knows what life after death is like. Nobody's come back 6 months later and said, hey, here's a description of what it's like out there after you die. So all of the religions of the world, one of the strengths of the great religions of the world is that they project some kind of an image of life after death, even though there's no empirical evidence for it whatsoever, is the way to think about it. So whose projection or position on a positive life after death is the correct one in light of no empirical evidence, one way or the other, with regard to resurrection of the dead, immortality of the soul, or reincarnation, or your spirit joining the spirits of the departed ones. And I have some friends who say that the guardian angel surrounds their life. Well, who are these guardian angels that are protecting you? Well, it's my deceased uncle, my deceased mother, my deceased grandmother. They're here to protect you. Yes, that's what they do. And if you were in China, and you were from one of the traditional Chinese religions, this would be your conception of life after death. and you would have a prayer shelf in your house where you would honor the departed loved ones who are still there in spirit in the room with you. That is their perception of what life after death is like. But there is no consensus on this issue, and it's the kind of issue that science in its methods is not capable of getting to. Now, inclusivism is the second preferred, and it's a kind of a middle ground. Christian inclusivism is a compromise between only one religion is true and all religions are equally true. It's really a serious attempt to do it, but it's also condescending. Placing Christianity, I would say, any other religion at the top of the two-tiered ranking order, and calling non-Christians anonymous Christians can be seen as patronizing. I don't know if some of you who are in the journey class remember this, but maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was Jeannie, it was you who brought in a Muslim woman who was one of our speakers. And we were talking to her, and she said, you're all anonymous Muslims. And I thought, well, explain that. Well, in the series of revelations, in terms of the scriptures, the Torah comes first, the New Testament comes second, and Quran comes third. The third replaces, or it's not replaced, but is superior to the other two, which had weaknesses, and therefore, if you're in one of the others, which are called peoples of the book, that's a stepping stone to the final revelation, which is Muhammad's revelation in the Quran, and therefore, if you are a member of one of the peoples of the book religions, which would be Christianity, you are really an anomalous Muslim. See, that's what you can do with the concept of anonymity. And then thirdly, the followers of other religions can claim Christians are anonymous believers of their faith, which is exactly. Hindus can say that. Hinduism is a great sponge. It absorbs a lot of different religions and finds a place for them in the religious concepts of their faith. So, pluralism is the most preferred. God's creative power incorporates our extremely aged and vast universe as modern science reveals it to us, and thus God's grace and love encompass all of humanity as well. And from the perspective of Christianity, this is consistent with the golden rule that is found in all faiths, the Bible, and church and Christ's teaching, which is in Matthew 7:12, and also God's grace, love, and salvation, that is, anticipating a positive afterlife, are available to all the faithful followers of the world's diverse religions, despite their differences, and are not the exclusive possession of any one religion. So, here's a graphic. Look at the left. This is the size of our universe, which we looked at earlier. It's monstrous. And the God who created that universe is probably even greater and more amazing. One thing that the followers of the monotheistic faith, starting with Zoroaster, even going right down to the high periods of Christian Islam, say God only reveals to us what God chooses to reveal to us, and there's so much about God that we don't know. And that is a pretty consistent idea. So our understanding of God is basically what God has chosen to reveal to us through our cultural experiences, and not through the cultural experiences of other people. And if this God, who is the creator of the universe, is as amazing as it is, it would be reasonable to conclude that God is too big to fit into simply one religion. That's a way to think about it. Or else the exclusivists possess God in their understanding of the nature of God as that has come to them out of their cultural traditions, even though the cultural traditions of other people and their conceptions of ultimate reality or God could be vastly different. And then you put God at the center of all the religions, just as a kind of way of saying, in some sense, the religions of the world call God by many different names. And any of you who have ever studied Joseph Campbell know that Joseph Campbell used to take this position with regard to his writings. And that is fairly typical of those who are involved in a lot of interfaith dialogue, like the Parliament of the World Religions and so on. So my friend Alan and I were just about ready to wrap this up and have time for some questions. Developed a new position, which we call Evolutionary Pluralism, EP. So evolutionary pluralism, so you get the evolution and you get the pluralism. So the evolution is part of the universe from the beginning. It's been evolving since the Big Bang. And the pluralism has to do with our increasing awareness of the diversity of religions on our planet. How do we reconcile? How do we bring together? Modern science gives us the most accurate view of our universe, how it started and evolved. Even though this will no doubt change in the future. It is probably the best picture to date. But science is very counterintuitive. And a lot of the new discoveries that happen as a result of research are not expected. That they change our view. We talked about that last week. For evolutionary pluralism and Christianity, this is important. Christ reveals God's love and offers Christians a way to salvation. That's very clear. So Christians have a complete view of not only how to believe and behave in this life, but expectations for a life after death that are associated with or connected to the founder of the faith, of course, who is Christ. However, number 3, unlike young earth creationism, old earth creationism, intelligent design creationism, and evolutionary creationism, evolutionary pluralism holds that a loving God has provided the followers of the world of birth space for alternative life after death images or pathways or stairways for anticipating a positive afterlife. Thus, as the global village expands, pluralism and not exclusivism or hierarchical inclusivism is the preferred Christian choice. Now, this is going to be unsettling to some people, and we realize that there will be pushback. And that's okay. This is simply a part of the conversation that is currently afoot out there right now as we become increasingly aware of the diversity, and as members of diverse faiths literally become our own neighbors next door. So how we deal with it is really important. Now, here are some related challenges that are associated with this position. It's called a foot in each camp. It is challenging for a person to be committed to any given faith and open to others as equals or as alternative pathways to knowledge. This is tough to do. I'm over here as a Christian person, you're a Muslim person. How far am I going to lean in the direction of accepting what you perceive as your understanding of how God has come into your situation? If I'm an exclusivist and the person over here is an exclusivist, there'll be very little conversation. Very little conversation. If I'm over here and I'm at least open to the possibility, and this person is open to the possibility, there can be some constructive creative dialogue, and so on. And all of the religions of the world hold out for those two possibilities, and so on. Engaging in interfaith dialogue. Most people give their time and commitments to their religious community and not to interfaith contact with people of other faiths. This is not unusual. It's not a problem. It's just the way we are as communities, our faith. And that altogether acceptable and normal and so on. But as we become more aware, one of the questions becomes, how do we deal with this larger community of people who are different from ourselves, even as we spend most of our time engaged in activities associated with our faith, which is entirely acceptable and normal. And the last one is called digging in or opening up. And the expanding global village can be seen as a threat for some people, turn off interfaith dialogue at all, or as an opportunity. And the question is, which way will Christianity go? And there is nothing on this page because I don't know. And if you do know, and if you can read the future, and you have a crystal ball that will tell you, this will be wonderful. But there is no guarantee that having more people from diverse backgrounds together in our society will necessarily automatically lead to greater dialogue. It could lead to more hostility, maybe even hatred and conflict. The other alternative is more dialogue, more possibility of interaction, and more possibility of growth in lots of different directions. And that is a big question mark out there. But our position is, let's remain open to the possibility that God speaks through many voices and in many ways, in many cultures, and we are beginning to appreciate those differences. And if we listen carefully, we can hear where other people come from as we share our own faith with them. So at that point, I will stop. and ask anybody. We have a few minutes left. Do you have any questions? You all agree? Well, that's not important. Just wonder if you have a question. You have time for it? Yes, Earl. I'm sorry?
I don't mean to sound cynical, but I have to think of the 9/11 airplanes and all of that. And what was their cry as they went into the buildings? It was all, that's very hard for me to consider.
Yeah, Islam is in a place right now in its own history where Christianity was during the Reformation. Let me give you an example. During the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, as Catholics and Protestants were battling each other, that resulted in Christians killing 7 million other Christians. That history is gone. Don't forget the Crusades, where Christians went into Israel now, or Palestine, and slaughtered Jews and Muslims in large numbers. Let's not forget Christian persecutions of Jews during almost 2,000 years of history in Europe. Christianity has gone through that hostile period. Islam is sort of where Christianity was a few centuries ago, in combating not only within itself between Shiites and Sunnis, but also different interpretations of Islam that range all the way from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is responsible for 9/11, and those Muslims who choose to live in peace with other religions. And believe me, they are out there in very large numbers, and I see them frequently when I encounter my students in class and other Muslims who look at ISIS and say that is not what Islam represents. That's a distortion of our true faith. Well, who is correct? It's going to take time for that to get worked out. And what we're in the midst of now is this sort of media feeding too of 9/11 and looking at the dark side of Islam, which is very brutal, as the recent assassination of the ISIS leader this past week demonstrated, and so on. And yet at the same time, there's this other part of Islam which is open to other possibilities of pluralism. And we don't hear much about that, but they're really out there. In the meantime, it behooves us to be cautious with regard to the truly violent jihadi wing of the modern interpretation of Islam without stereotyping all the others. That's the kind of caution that we need to be aware of. But from Osama bin Laden's standpoint, it was the West that was trying to impose itself on Islamic culture in the form of a genocide against the values of Islam, and he struck back. That's his interpretation, and the interpretation of 9/11 depends upon which side of the pond you were on. On our side of the pond, it was an aggressive, offensive, unjustifiable action that resulted in the death of 3,000 people. From Osama bin Laden's perspective, it was a defensive action against the encroachments of the West on Islamic culture. And who's correct? Depends on which side of the pond you're on, is another issue. But that's a very, very good point to raise, because it's the word of caution that we all need to hear as we go into this new era of global pluralism and how we're ultimately going to react to it. So it's not, let me correct your word, necessarily a cynical comment. It's a comment that's grounded in reality, and therefore we have to deal with it. Very good question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking of early Judaism and how they destroyed all the nations around them,
Right.
killed all the people. And to me, it's almost like an evolution of religion from we're going to conquer the physical way on this earth to a spiritual conquering.
That's part of it, but if you look at where Israel is right now, it's surrounded by enemies, outnumbered 50 to 1, in terms of Palestinians and other Arab groups who really do not like what the Jews are doing in Israel at all. And when you think about the Jews being in diaspora for a couple thousand years after the war, let's say 70 Common Era, when the Romans defeated the Jews and destroyed the Second Temple, to get back to Israel and call it your homeland, which originally was called the land of milk and honey for them, which resulted in destroying all those tribes you're talking about, of Canaanites, is quite a remarkable feat that they're even back there. But the idea that they're living in a peaceful environment is a stretch of the imagination, because they are surrounded by lots of enemies who would seek to destroy them. That is one of the hot spots, and a lot of Muslims consider the establishment of Israel by the United Nations, which was led by the United States and England, to be the last gasp of a dying colonial era that lasted 400 years. When most of the nations during the 20th century overthrew colonial rule and established their own political autonomy. Once again, it depends on sort of which side of the pond you're on with regard to how you not only interpret 9/11, but how you understand the role of Judaism and Islam, and I would add the other face of the world as well. And whether we can learn to live together pluralistically and peacefully, as opposed to engendering more hatred and hostility, still remains to be seen. And I have people who say, well, in the long run, we will. And my question is always what? What's the long run? How long is it going to take before we work out all these antagonisms? And if we continue to remain exclusivists in that sense, traditional sense, as our world becomes more religiously pluralistic, this challenge is even greater. But it is not inevitable which way we're going to go. Yes, sir?
You talk about interfaith dialogue. I don't see a lot of that going on, but that's just from my perspective. What prevents people in general from having just dialogue, to listen to others, just in general? What makes people unwilling to engage in other people's ideas?
This is a good question. Why aren't we more open to pluralism, to interfaith dialogue? And the answer is, it is the nature of faith to be so powerful in our lives that if we declare ourselves to be a Christian, that's where we want to spend our time. If we declare ourselves to be a Muslim, that's where we want to spend our time. If you go to Japan and you ask, and I'm unfortunate to be able to do this, ask people what their religion is, and they'll say something like this. I'm a Confucian in the daytime, I'm a Taoist in the evening, and I'm a Buddhist when I die. In other words, they have three faiths that they adhere to. And to be a Confucian doesn't mean you can't be a Taoist or you can't be a Buddhist. The same is also true in Japan. You can have 3 or 4 different religions simultaneously. I have some friends who are Japanese students when I was in Japan, and I asked them what their religion was, and one of them was Christianity. And I said, well, that makes 4 rather than 3. He said, why Christianity? He said, because Christianity has the best wedding ceremonies. And when you get married, let's get married according to Christian custom, rather than these other old ancient customs of Shinto and so on and so forth. It's really true. Being your own, but if you go to somebody who's Jewish and you say, are you Jewish? They say, I'm Jewish. They say, well, you also Muslim. Ask somebody who's a Christian in here, are any of you also Jewish or Muslim? The answer to the question doesn't make sense. That's called exclusivist religion. It's a closed religion. It's not a religion that couples with other religion, as, for example, in either China or Japan, or what we call the Far East. So, again, that's a cultural issue. And I would submit, and I think this is empirically true, that the greatest amount of violence that's been committed by religions in the world have come out of the monotheistic religions. And the reason for that is because of that strong sense of my faith, right or wrong, exclusivism, the highway or the byway, or so my way or the highway. And it's hard for people who, to answer your question, who are in one of the monotheistic faiths to really feel a sense of openness. It's one of the great challenges to those who come from other positions and who actively seek them out to engage in conversation. And I don't see there's anything wrong with it. I think we have to feel comfortable in our faith. But I think in a pluralistic environment, we have to increasingly be open to new possibilities where they emerge, even if it means talking to that neighbor, which may be the only Hindu we've ever met, but who suddenly is a friendly neighbor. And we get an insight into that person's faith in a way we never possibly understood before. That opens up conversation, and that's a step in the right direction. How many of those conversations do we have to have before